like to introduce our speaker this evening. We have Jim Bristol with us. He's a well-respected speaker, facilitator, educator, author, and thought leader in his field. He's passionate about educating people and organizations on creating deliberate cultures that foster collaboration, inclusion, and creativity. For over 20 years, he's facilitated powerful in-depth workshops on team-based project management and business analysis techniques. He provides consulting on organizational strategy and frameworks and runs his company, Clarus. Jim currently facilitates the Team Dynamics and Leadership course as part of SFU's Business Analysis Certificate Program. He is the author of Jones, Crafting a Resilient Life in an Increasingly Chaotic World, and Software Teamwork, Taking Ownership for Success. Despite the advances in the awareness and application of business analysis skills and techniques, in the past few decades, we've often continued to suffer from gaps in analysis outcomes that result in more challenging, unsuccessful projects than we would like to acknowledge. There are well-known techniques and skills that can improve your analysis skills, but these aren't currently covered in the traditional BA training and certification programs. Jim will begin this webinar with a reflection on our personal project experiences before he introduces a few skills and perspectives to add to your toolkit to significantly improve your business analysis and project outcomes. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's always awkward when people talk about me like that in an introduction, but I get over it. So I'd like to, I'll drop into PowerPoint. We're going to be doing a couple of things tonight. You're going to be participating in this. This isn't just me killing you with PowerPoint. There's going to be a couple of breakouts. There's going to be a few other things that we're going to do here. But first, I'd like to thank the local chapter of the IIBA for inviting me out here for the opportunity to chat today. And this talk, this really comes from my experience in delivering and supporting large and small projects over 40 years now. I'll probably be introducing some new ideas. I might be challenging some of your beliefs tonight. But I want to be very clear that what I'm going to be talking about tonight isn't about throwing away everything you know about business analysis. It is about adding more to your repertoire of things that you can do to be effective in your business analysis approaches. And a lot of the things that we talk about are going to be new to many of you because they're not in the domain of what we talk about when we talk about business analysis. A little bit more of my background. I've got a tech background. I've actually got a physics degree. And I did about 10 years of embedded systems work in Ottawa before I came out to Vancouver. Small teams, small projects, and you could be pretty loose with defining your requirements. You could kind of get them on the fly on those small projects. I came out to Vancouver in 1990, and I spent 6 years working on an air traffic control project. And at the time, I was called a business analyst simply because that was the stage of the project that we were in. I had no BA training. I was given a very expensive case tool and a very expensive workstation, but not a lot of skills in business analysis. And we somehow managed to get through that. And we actually delivered a really successful project, even if it was 12 years late and $1 billion over budget. And some of my best business analysis horror stories come from that project, but that's for another day. After that, I got into consulting. I did process consulting for a while until I realized that process really isn't the important thing, although that is top of mind in most people's thinking these days in the software world and a lot of other domains as well. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been running requirements training. You're probably familiar with Carl Wiegers. I've been running his material for 20 years around the world. I ran it for 3 years as the only person in the world running business analysis training for Hewlett Packard. I run project management training. I run training in resilience, and all of these, I put a very decidedly human perspective on top of things, and I think that's very important. As Mona said, I'm involved in the BA certificate program in SFU, also the PM certificate program, and now the business management program as well. So a lot of background there, but we're going to see something a little bit different today. And so the agenda is, we're going to start with your experience as was described, and that will reveal, as I've seen this happen so many times in the past, a not so secret secret. And we'll get to that, and we'll identify that secret, and why I'm calling it a secret, I'll get to that, is something that we all have experience with. And we'll use that as a basis for moving forward. And we will look at a survey of a variety of strong practices that are really effective, that to make you a more effective collaborator, if you will. And they come generally from the discipline of organization development. And what I'm saying is that while it's good to have expertise in a domain like business analysis or project management, there's something that all of us on projects have in common: we're humans. And a lot of what we talk about today are intended to help you realize the critical elements, how critical it is to pay attention to the human element as you're working together in organizations. And if we do that correctly, we're going to, most problems here, we're going to be building a more complete system for how we work together. It's going to go beyond the realm of what you see in the BA BOK or in the PM BOK or any of these BOKs that we have around as well. But the important thing is that it is just as disciplined as what we have in business analysis and project management today. And very few people in those realms really appreciate that. So I'm going to go through a few steps to get you thinking about that. So I want to start first by you reflecting on your past experience. And in preparation for doing this, I'm going to ask that one of the organizers set up the breakout rooms for groups of 3 or 4 at random. And we will be running those breakout rooms for 8 minutes. So while they're setting that up, let me describe what I'm going to ask you to do in these breakout rooms. So first, I want you to think of the best project experience you've ever had. You don't have to have been in a particular role. You don't have to have been the BA or the PM or any of these things. You just need to have been involved with other people trying to solve a problem or build something. It could have been a formal project. It could have been an informal project outside the workplace. It could have been working with a nonprofit. It could have been a sports team trying to win the season. It could have been a home renovation, whatever it might be. I want you to think about the project that you recall as the best project you've ever been on, and think about the characteristics that made it a great project for you. Not what did you build or what did you provide, but what were the characteristics that made it a great project for you? Okay. Now, as you can expect, I want you to do the same and think about your worst project experience that you've ever had. Okay. And again, you don't have to have been in a particular role. It could have been formal or informal. But what were the characteristics that made it a bad project for you? And hopefully, it's not the project that you're currently on. Okay. And then what I want you to do is capture in chat first the characteristics of your best projects that you've been on. Like I asked one person from each group to act as a scribe, if you could just drop some of the observations, especially if you've got common themes, capture them in chat, and let's let that roll by and see what everybody has to say.
Sorry, Jim, we're putting in the bad projects?
The good projects first.
Okay, good projects.
So Howard starts out collaborative, good communication, SMEs deliver their work, success and outcomes, strong sponsorship with excitement throughout an organization, clear to see the value of the project, people know their roles, decision-making ability, trust, openness, transparency. People take ownership, trust, your work is adding value, flexible environment, teamwork, energy, diversity of the team, no egos, knowledge, open-minded line of communication to get through the norming and storming phases of collaboration. We'll talk about that later. Project sponsor and product owner communication, iterative, minimal viable product change management, resource consistency, team togetherness, skilled resources, company structure as checks and balances, energy, diversity of the team, measurable outcomes. We're seeing a lot of really good stuff here that people have had on their projects, sharing of expertise. So there might be a few more of these that flow in here, but let's start to capture the characteristics of your worst projects now. And again, hopefully this isn't bringing up some bad thinking about the project that you're on right now. Well, it doesn't meet expectations. That's a bad sign right away. Managers micromanage, poor lack of communication with stakeholders and team, lacks change management processes, insufficient resources or budget are available. Project managers didn't listen to their SMEs. Toxic team environment. I like exploring the worst projects you've been on because the language gets more interesting. Bad project, lack of direction, unknown priority, no acknowledgement, people working on different project and can't commit, no customers' interest. That's kind of bad from a BA perspective. Unclear scope, failed to see the overarching process. Leaders didn't make the project a high priority, not much buy-in. Lack of interaction, isolation, wrong people for roles, lack of trust, no customer interest, unrealistic expectations, no sponsors support. Again, we're seeing a lot of similarities here. Lack of trust, no change readiness plan, no goals, lack of support. Project got put on low priority, no risk planning. So a lot of bad things that are going on in projects and a lot of good things that are going on in projects. And if you look at everything that everybody identified here, and we'll just let a few more of these keep rolling on here, everything that everyone identified in your best and worst characteristics of projects, how much of this has to do with tools and technology? A minority at the very most.
At
Cindy?
least 50%.
Hmm?
At least 50%.
Do you think so? Tools
Or even higher, not having access to the right tools, not everyone on the team having permissions to especially in an organization, to all the same tools, knowledge of the tools as well.
Any other thoughts about that? Last note here is politics, and Judy put 10% in there. In my experience, tools do show up once in a while, but a lot of what we see, and when we see things like repetition, we see things like lack of trust, or there is trust in good projects. There's collaboration in the teams. There is, let's see what some of the other things, lack of interaction here, isolation, no customer interest, managers micromanage, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of the human element that everybody identifies on when they look at when they recall their best and worst project experiences. Okay, and that's something that has occurred over and over again when I've asked these questions for groups from all different domains, over the last 20, 25 years. Okay. And that is something that I think is the reason that I'm running this talk today, because what happened is I went to the BA and PM conference last fall that was sponsored by the IIBA and the local chapter of the PMI. One of the things that I noticed, especially getting into the second day, every single talk that I went to, the person who was running the talk was typically going to be talking about some technical issue around business analysis or project management or some combination of the two. And at some point, often in the beginning of the talk, they'd say, kind of off to the side, they'd say, well, you know, a lot of it has to do with human interaction, that sort of thing. But they didn't really have anything to back that up. And then they went back into the technical conversation about what they wanted to cover. So they kind of identified this as this little secret that everybody, you know, that everybody talks about, but there's no meat behind it, if you will. And so that, I think, raised a real red flag for me. And it basically said that there isn't really an awareness of these things and the importance of these on projects. So what we're going to do is we're going to go a little further down and talk about why I think this is an important consideration to deal with. And I'm going to go back into PowerPoint here. And so I want to talk about language and focus first. Our language can literally have an impact on what we see. So if we live in a culture where we have a language that has a really rich lexicon of words for a particular color, for example, such as blue, we learn to discriminate between those shades. We can see and make distinctions between cerulean and ocean blue and navy blue and cobalt and indigo and turquoise and sapphire and baby blue and all those things. But if you're in a culture that does not have a wide variety of words to express different shades of blue, you literally cannot discern those different shades. If the language does not exist for certain concepts, they're invisible. So as we get deeper and deeper into the training, in technical training on projects, whether that's BA or PM or any of those things, or business administration, for example, we tend to use parts of our language more frequently, they get more emphasis, and other parts of our language are diminished, are used less frequently. And so if you think about it, terms like trust, respect, integrity, empathy, they're not in the BA BOK. And because of that, what happens when we don't have these terms in our lexicon, when we're immersed in technology and when we're immersed in process, these terms, these concepts can fall off our radar. Okay. When you have a problem with our communication, we seek a resolution from our trusted lexicon, from our technology. We might add or beef up a template. We might change our process in some way. We might add more checks and balances, but we often fail to consider the massive impact and the nuances of human interaction. And I think we do that to the detriment of our projects. One last thing about those questions that I asked for your breakouts there. For a while, what I would do is when people finished off and reported out, I would ask them if they were thinking about a formal project or an informal project when they were thinking about their worst or their best project experiences. And it turns out that when people are talking about their best project experiences, most of those are informal projects. And when they're talking about their worst project experiences, most of those, and this is a survey of about 220 projects from around the world that I ran a few years ago, when they're looking at their worst project experiences, most of those come from formal projects. Now, there may be things like formal projects being bigger, that sort of thing, but I would also argue that in a formal project, we tend to focus more on the technology and the process and less on human interaction. And I think we suffer a bit from that. So what does the BA-BOK have to say about some of these terms? Well, they talk about facilitation and they call it the art of leading and encouraging people through systemic efforts, blah, blah, blah. Facilitation as an art, or no, I disagree. I think it's just as much a science, but it's not really appreciated as a science. And we'll dive into that a bit more deeper as we go here. An actor in business analysis, a human device or a system. We're putting those in the same camp. This is like human resources. Humans are not desks. Humans are not laptops. Humans are very distinct from devices or systems, and that's very important. I don't want to be put in the same camp as a device or a system. What else do we have in here from the BA-BOK? Collaboration, the act of two or more people working together towards a common goal. I don't want you to act on me. I want to interact with you. I want to engage with you. And finally, customers are a stakeholder. This is a very sterile definition. A stakeholder who uses or may use products or services produced by the enterprise and may have contractual or moral rights. Very sterile, very not human at all. And you don't see words like trust, integrity, respect, that sort of thing in the BA-BOK. So it is great at identifying the techniques and skills around gathering information that can be resolved into a specification for what to be built on a project, but it doesn't take into account, and it's written in a very sterile form that takes us away from thinking about the human side of things. Okay. Back when we did face-to-face workshops, one of the things that I would do is I would hand out Post-its, and at the end of the session, and get them to just describe what they thought of the session. And this comes from this Post-it comes from a project management session that I ran. And the first day was talking about a lot of the things like I talk about here this evening. And the second day was more traditional project management stuff, but done with a focus, with an emphasis on collaboration. And this person who's got his MBA, he's got his PMP, and I've seen similar reactions from BAs and sessions as well, said the first day is a lot of personality and social stuff, like that fluffy stuff, those soft skills that people talk about. And then he said the second day contains the meat of project management techniques. And my job tonight is to try to let you know that that first day, the stuff that we're talking about today, is just as important as the hard skills that we're talking about here. As Judy talks about in chat there, she says 80% people, 5 to 10% tools, methodologies, 10 to 15% processes. I think that's probably an appropriate balance. Any other observations, Judy, on that? Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Expand on it. No, just 25 years of experience.
So those are the numbers are anecdotal from your perspective, but I don't think they're out of whack. I really don't.
As I said, 25 years of experience. I counted 3 months ago, 47 projects that I've worked on. Mm-hmm. So I know it's a small sample size, but even so.
Well, that's a fairly substantial sample size, because it echoes what I've heard from many, many people over the years. Okay. And so I think the key thing there is that while BA, business analysis, is an expertise, a set of skills, as is project management, that sort of thing. And it's valuable for individuals on a project to have that set of skills to complement the other skills. In reality, the stuff we're talking about tonight is the domain of everyone on the project, and everybody should be practicing those skills. And as a BA, essentially as a leader, you should be thinking about exhibiting these skills to both A, demonstrate that you are a more effective BA as a result of these things, and B, to show others that there is a different way of interacting on projects that can be very, very valuable. And the reason behind this, what I see happening over the last 5, 10 years, 15 years or so, is a generational shift that's occurring. And we can compare it to what happened about a century ago with the Industrial Revolution. So back in the old days, about 150 years ago, there was this massive burst of new, relatively free energy with petroleum. And it gave us the opportunity to tackle big projects. It brought command and control, it brought us Gantt charts, and it brought us all the dysfunction in every Dilbert cartoon you've ever seen. So it served us very well. The Industrial Revolution allowed us to do massive things, national railroads, building out very well integrated healthcare systems, very large projects. It's all driven around control and structure and process. And the benefits are repeatability and predictability. Okay, and about it from the human side, we're looking at labor and unions and employment and that sort of thing. What I'm arguing is that we are in the midst of another revolution, a knowledge revolution. And you can think about it as the internet, access to data, global connectivity. And this is something that is driving a shift in the nature of projects that we run on. So instead of looking at large projects as being the key driver here, we're looking at creativity and innovation, where the supporting mechanisms aren't about necessarily process and automation so much as diversity and inclusion. Those have become really hot words in the last 3 years, but I think they've been important for decades, for at least 2 or 3 decades anyways, and it's growing. What we get out of this is flexibility and collaboration when we flatten the hierarchy. And we can get disruptive innovation with this creativity and innovation that we drive things here. And from the human element, we're no longer simply laborers. We have opportunities for self-actualization, we have autonomy. We have an opportunity to be more deeply engaged in our work and to get more benefit personally out of that work. And I think that's really important. It allows us to get away from the human resources way of thinking where humans are no different than laptops. And the traditional thinking isn't keeping up with this. The project management body of knowledge version 7, which came out a year or so ago, it finally mentions some of the ideas that I talk about tonight as new, whereas I got to tell you that a lot of them are 40, 50, 60 years old. They're just new to the people that have been focused on the PM domain, and the BA BOK is still lagging in those areas as well. We're only up to version 3 of the BA BOK, and I believe that eventually it will follow along with as the PM BOK has done, and it will start to appreciate the value of the human element. And we'll see how that goes over the next 10 or 15 years or so. So I want to get identify this chart comes from an article that I published with Amplify last year, talking about the shift in power and culture that I see. And it was actually a very well received article, and it surprised a lot of people with what I had to say in there. And I'll make that available to you after this session. So a couple of ideas that I just want to bring into play here, and we'll look at some of these things here. So there's a few gaps with the traditional thinking around people as widgets sort of thing that are interreplaceable in there. And the first is that we need to first and foremost pay attention to ourselves and raise our self-awareness before we can actually raise awareness of others. And some of you may be familiar with this concept here. It's a psychological model called the Johari window. And this actually came about in 1955 from Joseph Luft and Harry Ingram. And what it does, it helps us to understand what we can do to increase our self-awareness, build our personal development, improve our communications, and eventually get to the point where we have more effective group dynamics and better teamwork as well. So along the horizontal axis, what you see is the degree of how much you know about yourself. On the left-hand side, you know things about yourself. On the right-hand side, you don't know these things. And on the vertical axis, it's how much others know about you. On the lower end here is things that others do not know about you. And up on top, there's things that people do know about you. And the point of looking at this, this model, if you will, is to look for ways to increase the size of your open or public window, if you will. And you can do that in a number of different ways. You want to increase that by simply asking for feedback, helping to learn more about yourself by letting other people tell you, describe their observations about how they interact with you, how you engage with them, that will give you insights that you can't get otherwise. So asking for feedback is a very powerful tool. On the other side of the equation, being more open about yourself, self-disclosure can be a very powerful tool to help reduce the size of that hidden area as well. And there's a lot of things that you can do for self-discovery to improve that unknown area, or to reduce that unknown area as well. And I think that that's one of the core elements that is critical for all of us to learn and grow over time. I journal on a daily basis, and I find that it is very useful, especially being able to look back and reflect on what happened in the past and what that made me do. So when I'm journaling, when I'm reflecting, I'm capturing what happened. Then I'm asking myself, what does that mean to me, and what do I do about it? How do I change? How do I evolve? And it's an ongoing process. So there's a lot of things that we can do as we work with ourselves and as we interact with others, the asking for feedback and the self-disclosure, that can make us more connected with ourselves, more connected with others from both perspectives in both directions. And we can broaden that open or public area, and it will generate more effective relationships, group dynamics, teamwork. It's a useful model to keep in mind and identify some behaviors that we should practice regularly to be more effective at that. Another thing that I think is really important about humans that's very different than external systems or things like that is culture. And Richard D. Lewis wrote a book called When Cultures Collide, and he described this culture this way: cultural behavior is the end product of collected wisdom, filtered and passed down through hundreds of generations as shared core beliefs, values, assumptions, notions, and persistent action patterns. Culture is really important. And the interesting thing about culture is that we all grow up within a culture. And until you are immersed in another culture, you have no idea that culture is even a thing. It's like fish going, you know, what is this water that we're breathing, sort of thing. And it's when you're immersed in a new culture, that's when you are kind of smacked upside the head. It's like, whoa, what was that, sort of thing. And so let me ask if there's anybody in the group who is relatively new to Canada and comes from a very different culture, or has been immersed in a different culture for the first time. And you might want to capture in chat or open up your mic and describe some of the surprising, perhaps jarring experiences that you may have had when you were immersed in another culture. Any thoughts, observations from anyone in the room there? Quiet group. Okay. I'll tell you a story. When I came to Vancouver, I was on that air traffic control project for 6 years. And in that air traffic control project, we, among other reasons, one of the reasons we had such a diverse group of people, we had 250 engineers on this project. One of the reasons we had such a diverse group of people is we were programming it in a language called Ada, which is not really that common. It's not like C or Python or any of those things. So we had people from all over the world, and it was very interesting to be immersed into this fishbowl of all these different cultures. And you know, you would experience things like I would be in the hallway, and I would see two people from Eastern Europe, for example, and they'd be right at each other's faces, and they'd be yelling and arguing about something very strongly, and then somebody would look at their watch and they'd say, "Oh, it's 12. Why don't we go for lunch?" Like, to be able to totally dissociate the technical argument around what was happening on a project with the camaraderie of working together. And that's something that is much more common in Eastern European cultures than you would see in a Canadian culture. And so to be exposed to that for the first time was like, oh my gosh, it's such a shock. And we all have these different shocks, and culture is a very, very important part on projects. It's one form of diversity, not the only form by any stretch. And actually in Burnaby, where I'm at right now, it has been identified as the most culturally diverse metropolitan area in the world. And if you're working on projects in town here, there's probably going to be a wide variety of different cultures of people that you're working with on your projects. So this is something to definitely keep in mind. Bill Marikine has this quote that I think is very interesting. He said that culture in the workplace can be expressed as how employees' hearts and stomachs feel about Monday on Sunday night. So the culture in the workplace can be an uplifting culture, or it could be a culture that drags you down. And again, you can go back and reflect on your best and worst experiences on projects. Culture was probably an important part of what made that a great or a horrible project for you. Okay. And culture also is one of the drivers that is something that allows us to see what is essentially the same thing very differently. So what I want you to do is to take a look at this picture, okay? And what I want you to do is to come up with just a short phrase that describes what you see, and drop that brief phrase into chat. What is it that you see in this picture? Let's see what we come up with. So Kindy is saying, "You listen to me," with an exclamation mark. Just what do you see in this picture? Pronouncing judgment. Someone giving out orders, one commanding to the other. He's giving a command. Accusations, interesting. How can I help you? A different spin on things. Authoritative. Comforting. Interesting. So we're getting a wide range of responses. I need you on my team. Someone getting up to leave a group and asking if one wants to come along. So this is interpreted, it's being interpreted very different ways by people in the group here. And one of the things that we need to learn to do, or we should do to be effective, is to learn to distinguish between observation, which is an objective thing, this, I see this happening, and thought, which is our stories that we create based on our observations. And those stories that we create are driven by our past experiences, our culture, and all those different things. And that notion of separating observation and thought comes from actually a prophet SFU, Gervais Bush, who wrote a book called Clear Leadership. And so we interpret situations based on our experience, and it's very heavily biased by our culture. And we have to learn to be able to separate those apart, because as you see in the descriptions in chat there, you've got very, very different perceptions of what's happening there. And we all do this all the time. We tell ourselves stories based on an observation that really doesn't necessarily justify that story. And we don't take the time to go back and confirm that that's actually what we saw. But then we act and behave on it that way. And it's a very dangerous way. It's what Gervais Bush calls interpersonal mush that happens on projects all the time. And we need to learn to get away from that. Okay. Another concept that's very important is similar to this, but it's understanding perceptions of one another. So when I'm interacting with the world, I have an internal set of motives. Okay. And when I interact with the world, those motives are going to drive my intentions, which in turn are going to drive my behaviors, and they're all going to be congruent with one another. I see myself based on why, the internal why I'm trying to do something. Now, one of the important things is that's critical about humans is that until we've really taken the time to learn this or think this through, we tend to presume that other people have the same set of internal drivers as we do. Very many of us don't really appreciate the diversity of those internal drivers, and culture is just one of those things. So until we do that, when we are observing other people, they only see, when somebody else is observing my behavior, they only see my external behavior. They don't see my intentions or my motives. And if their intentions or motives are very different than mine, they might look at my behavior and they go, well, that was crazy. Why would he do something like that? It doesn't make any sense. Okay. And so really what we want to do is we need to learn to be able to avoid having these conflicts because of a misunderstanding of internal motives. And we need to learn to peel back the layers of the onion. Okay. So that doesn't mean that we have to have the same motives as others. We need to appreciate that other people will have different motives. And that's got to be cool, because my motives and intentions are just as valid to me as yours are to you. And it's not your job to change somebody else. It's your job to appreciate that their motives are different than yours, and they will end up interpreting and behaving against a situation that we're both in a very different way than I do. Not only is that good, that is the essence, that is the power of inclusion. That is accepting that different people seeing things and behaving different ways is actually a superpower in teams if we can harness that effectively. Okay. So that is really important. And it ties into this notion of diversity and inclusion that has become such a big word or a big thing over the last couple of years, but it's been important for a while. And diversity and inclusion are two very, very different things. Diversity is just saying that you and I are different in some way that we can measure. It's a stat, if you will. Inclusion is the degree to which I am open to accepting and embracing that diversity that you have from me in a way that makes us collaboratively stronger than only one of us. So we have this set of quadrants here as well, and we can have the degree of diversity on the left to right quadrants here, left to right direction here, and where there's no diversity over on the left and there's more on the right, and the degree of inclusiveness there as well. So if you're in an organization where there really is no diversity, there's a lot of blind sides and gaps in your perception that you're not even aware of. And that is something that speaks to the value of growing to be more diverse in an organization. But if we get to the point where we're down here and we increase our diversity without becoming inclusive at the same time, we're going to fall into chaos and conflict when we have these differences in perspective or different viewpoints that aren't reconciled well. And we want to get to the point where we can appreciate the diversity, and typically we're going to go through a little bit of pain in that chaos and conflict section there before we get to true diversity. So that chaos, it might be mild amusement, or it could be accidental collisions like misinterpreting body language from different cultures. Going through that conflict and chaos is going to, you're going to step on some people's toes as you learn to appreciate and be inclusive when you've got people that are widely diverse from you. And so we need to have an environment where we're allowed to make mistakes along the journey, and we need to be working together to build a highly inclusive environment that we're working in, and it will make us more powerful as a team. Okay. I'm going to go through one more little exercise for you. So we did the prelude, which was the past project experience. Now I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of a reflection here. And we're going to be dropping into breakout rooms again. So if you could set up breaking rooms again, groups of 3 at random for about, call it 6 minutes this time. So what I'm going to ask you to do is right now, I want you to reflect for a moment. And I want you to choose your top 3 characteristics, roles, or attributes that you hold most dearly about yourself, all positive. Okay, it might be that I am musical, I am a father, I am a trainer. You're going to have your own set of 3 different things. Choose the ones. They don't necessarily have to be work related. It's about you personally. Okay, what are the top 3 characteristics that you most identify yourself by? Give yourself a minute to think about that. Then what I want you to do in breakouts, I want you to report out on your top 2. And I want you to describe to the others in your group how they would be of value in an organization. Like I said, choose attributes that are about you personally, not necessarily about your work-related self. And identify in breakouts to the other people in your group how they would be of value to you in an organization. And if it's difficult for you to figure out how that might fit, get your peers' perspectives on that as well. And you'll find that generally you're going to find a good fit. Okay. So you'll be in breakout rooms for 6 minutes this time. So be crisp with your discussions. And again, we'll respond just in general plenary and then we'll take a quick 5-minute break after this. So into your breakout rooms for 5 minutes, and we'll see where this goes. 2 questions for you, and then we'll take a quick 5-minute break. First question. Did anybody in any of your groups identify a characteristic or a role or an attribute that you really struggled to identify the kind of value it would bring to the workplace? Did anybody have any of those situations?
Not in ours.
No.
Yeah.
I think most of the time, even if it's not a direct relationship, like being a father, for example, you know, can map to some powerful things in the workplace because I am looking out for others. And similarly, if you're a mother, you're a nurturing person is probably going to be one of your characteristics, that sort of thing. Very rarely will somebody run into something that you cannot identify as a valuable thing in the organization. So let me flip the question around. I want you to think about the number one characteristic or attribute or role that you identified, the thing that you hold most dearly to yourself. Okay. If you were in an organization where you were told, we don't appreciate that here, we will not allow you to have that characteristic in this organization, I want you to drop into chat what your reaction is to that. Yikes, says Heather. Shock, and I would leave. I will be sad. Why? Now you're going to see some of these, keep these reactions coming in here, and they're all going to be of a similar vein, I'm sure. But there are people who are working in organizations where they are not appreciated for who they are. And there's this notion in business where you're told to basically leave your baggage at the door, and you got a job to do. And I think that that is garbage. I think that's crazy. And I think that if you're in an organization where you are diminished in any way, where you're not appreciated for who you are, and there are a lot of people that are working under those conditions, then I don't believe there is a way that you can give your all to the job at hand. And I think that you're in a situation where you are limited. There's a ceiling to how much you can contribute in an organization like that. And that is probably the essence of what inclusion is really all about. It is not everybody being the same. It is everybody appreciating and valuing the differences that people bring to the table for how it makes the organization a much more comprehensive, powerful unit. Okay. So that is a really important concept. And we need to be in tune with who we are, what we believe is the essence of who we are. And we need to work in an organization where we can have that as a way of living, as a way of working, as a way of being, because I don't really see my work self and my personal self being two distinct personalities. I think there's a lot of problems associated with that. Any questions or thoughts or observations before we take a 5-minute break? Okay, so it's 7:20 right now. Let's get back online. I'll start talking again at 7:25, and we'll close out with a few other thoughts. Okay. So we'll get rolling again, and we're going to start off with a video. You may have seen this video before. It's only about 3 minutes long. It's from Brene Brown, and it's about a topic called empathy. Oh.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Connection is the key thing behind empathy here, and many of us are really sloppy with empathy. We'll sit down with somebody else and we'll say, I understand your situation sucks right now, and that sort of thing, but we need to do this sort of thing. Empathy, as Brene Brown talks about in that video, is more than that. There's 4 characteristics that she talks about. There is taking perspective and staying out of judgment. So taking perspective is to understand why the people feel the way they do, and staying out of judgment, not if it's different than the way you see the situation. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, we've really got no right to do so. It doesn't make any sense. We shouldn't be judging others that way. There will be times that there's emotion involved, and then we need to communicate it. And I think the key thing for me about empathy, and it's interesting because the last time I ran a talk like this, when we did that exercise before break about things that we identify about ourselves, and I asked if anybody came up with something that they couldn't figure out how it would fit in the workplace, one person actually stated that she was empathetic and she couldn't figure out how that would fit in the workplace. And that's kind of the way we've been driven in this command and control structure to leave some of that stuff at the door. But empathy, I think, is absolutely essential in the workplace. And it's more than just to say dismissively that, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I think the way it's best described, Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, and he described it this way, is that you can only know that you truly empathize when the other person says, thanks. I wish I could have described my situation as eloquently as you just did. So empathy is not agreement. It's just about understanding why people have the perspective they carry. It's not about changing. It's about learning from others. And it takes time, especially if you're very different in how you're seeing the same situation. It takes time to have a conversation to get to true empathy. And again, remember, if your views and your perspectives are real and important and valid to you, why think any less of anybody else's views and perspectives? We need to be able to empathize with that and to just understand it, not necessarily agree with it. It's really important. Okay, so empathy is a huge, powerful element. And as Brené talked about in the video there, we need to cultivate our ability to truly empathize with others to be effective. Another thing this is probably the number one thing that I look for when I'm working with organizations, is psychological safety today. And there's actually, the way you could describe psychological safety, it's being able to be yourself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. In psychologically safe teams, members feel accepted and respected. And we've talked a bit about that. And it's measurable and it can be intentionally developed. And there's a scale of psychological safety, if you will, from Timothy Clark. And there's 4 different stages of a psychologically safe environment. And he said, it's a condition in which humans feel included as the first stage, and then they feel comfortable and safe to learn, comfortable and safe to be a contributor, and true psychological safety gets us to the point of being able to safely challenge the status quo. So there's a number of stages that we can get to. And there's actually a Canadian standard for psychological safety that was established about a decade ago. It's literally a CSA standard that you can download, and it talks about these things. And psychological safety is a very important element in the workplace. 1 in 5 Canadians experience a psychological health problem or illness in any given year. Psychological health problems and illnesses are the #1 cause of disability in Canada. Psychological health problems cost the Canadian economy $51 billion a year, 20 billion of which results from work-related causes, and 40% of working Canadians consider their work to be the most stressful part of daily life. Imagine if we could deal with some of these stats and make some adjustments to there. It would be just fabulous in the workplace. And there's something that I'm going to, basically as a postlude, I'm going to pass this along as essentially a self-test. We're not going to do it here, but it's a collection of questions that Amy Edmondson from, I think she's based with Harvard these days. And she talks a lot about teams, and she's got a list of 10 questions from her book, The Fearless Organization. And these 10 questions are things that you can ask yourself. And again, I'll have these as a handout that you'll be able to take. And what I would suggest you do is you take the time and rank yourself on a 1 to 5 scale for each of these questions to see how far along you are on this psychologically safe scale. And what you'll probably find is that there's going to be some elements where you are not optimal, not at the top of the scale there. And it's great fodder to ask yourself, what can I do about this? How can I become more psychologically safe? Is there something I can do myself? Is there discussions we need to have in our teams? In some situations, it may be time to look for another place to work. Okay, this is a very important concept for your own health, for your own well-being. I was on that air traffic control system. I lasted 6 years, and my doctor told me I had to leave because I was having stress-related illnesses. So psychological safety is a really important element to consider in the workplace. Another characteristic that I think is really valuable is humility. Edward Schein, who unfortunately passed away January 26th of this year, he's a former professor of the MIT Sloan School of Management. And he wrote a book, I don't know if you see my picture of this, very thin book, called Humble Inquiry. And he says it's the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions to which you do not already know the answer, of building a relationship based on curiosity, and interest in the other person. And he identifies three different forms of humility. He identifies basic humility, intrinsic respect based on the status that you were born into. He talks about optional humility, respect based on achievements of others. And he talks about here and now humility, which is really dominant in the workplace. And the fact that we are really interdependent in the workplace, and we do have needs of each other in the workplace. And if we appreciate that and we engage with others in a way that, in a humble manner that allows us to draw out what we need from others in an effective, curious way, we're going to be way better off. And what he says in the book is our culture emphasizes that leaders must be wiser, set direction, and articulate values, all of which predisposes them to tell rather than to ask. Yet it is leaders who will need humble inquiry most, because complex, interdependent tasks will require building positive, trusting relationships with subordinates to facilitate good upward communication. And you can test this idea yourself. Think about a conversation in which you were the subordinate or had a lower status than the other person and felt respected and acknowledged. And if you think about that, you can probably identify some of the characteristics or some of the behaviors that the other person did to make you feel that way. And it probably was not in the realm of just giving you the answer or setting direction. It was about listening. It was about paying attention to you, about being curious and interested in who you are. So humility, and this is a really, really good book to go with, is another important aspect. So I talked about a number of things today, and they all fall into the realm of what we call organization development. Okay, and there's the Organization Development Network has a competency framework. Think of it as the equivalent of the BA-BOK or the PM-BOK. And the nice thing about this global competency framework, and I'm going to have links to this stuff, is that unlike what we see in the BA-BOK or the PM-BOK, at least till recently, it is impossible to really interpret this as a process, which I think is very, very powerful. So it supports career development. It can help you define a clear set of knowledge, skills, and behaviors to determine your current proficiency, and from that, figure out how to advance them. It sets professional standards. There's a lot of master's programs in OD, things like that, that lean on this global competency framework as a way of building out that structure, and it gives you a common language. So almost everything that I talked about today falls into this realm. It's been established for decades. It's not art. It's just as science as what we have in business analysis and project management. And I think it's really, really valuable to pay attention to that, in addition to the technical skills that we have as business analysts, to make us more effective collaborators. Okay. And looking at the time there, just one more thing. One of the things that's, if anything about people is bantered around on projects, it's this notion of team building. And team building is usually implemented way too lightly. It's not having a team lunch or having a foosball table, although that could be part of it. But it's really a deliberate process of developing and maintaining the team so it functions as its leaders and members want. It's about intentionally building a culture Deliberate in that there's an intentional set of behaviors, and a lot of them I talked about tonight, discussions and attitudes to effectively to engage with others effectively. And it's a process. It takes time to develop trust. You can't just say, you must trust me. Trust can take days, weeks, months, years to develop. Sometimes it doesn't at all. And mutual respect, again, is not something that you can tell people to do. It's something that is based on their experience of engaging with one another. And you've probably seen this model before. It's the Tuckman model, the stages of team development. You might not recognize it by the name, the Tuckman model, but if I called it the forming, storming, norming, performing model, I think somebody mentioned it earlier in the session tonight in chat. This is something that's been around for decades as well. And usually it's presented in these 4 different stages. And almost always it's interpreted as the team is in stage X, whether we might be in the infighting stage or the performing stage, whatever it might be. But I look at it in a different way. I think of it as a team is going to have a pie that has 4 different slices. There's going to be a forming slice, a storming slice, a norming slice, and a performing slice, all at the same time, because you can be on a team with somebody you've worked with for decades and you can complete each other's sentence and you have absolute trust in one another. And at the same time, somebody else on the team, you just don't get along with. You can't trust them. You don't get along. You can't, hate to be around them. And then there's new people joining the team and you need to figure out how are they going to fit, what's going to happen there, sort of thing. So it's really not we're in stage X, but this is the way our current team maturity pie is sliced. And how it's sliced is a function of all of the individual relationships amongst everybody on the team. And you own half of that, every one of those relationships for somebody that you're connected with. And a lot of the things that I talked about tonight are things that we need to pay attention to. And if we do that and we learn and we grow from that, we can be more effective in our role. We can have better experiences on our projects, and everybody benefits from this way of behaving. So that's it from my perspective. I've introduced a number of new ideas. Actually, nothing's new. These have been around for a while. They've just been invisible to most people in the technology space. And we need to build these in. It needs to become part of our vernacular, part of our vocabulary. And it is much science as it is, as we see in the BA BOK or any of those things. And if BAs are collaborators, if they're connectors, if they're bridges, we're leaders too. And we need to up our game with these skills. There's still plenty of value to mine there. We need to cross-train and to not simply get stuck in the ways of technology. It starts with ourselves. It grows with our relationships. Think of it as a lubrication to make our BA skills more effective. Okay, that's it from my perspective. I've got a few other slides. I'll hand the deck around as well. I see somebody's already dropped the global framework. Pindy's already done that for me, but it's in there as well. There's also the local chapter of the ODN, the BC ODN. I'm actually on the board of that nonprofit right now and I joined that board because I really believe that it is important that more people understand that this is a real discipline. Okay, so I've got some links there for things I've talked about tonight. And I've also got some books that I think are a great way to start the journey as well. And other than that, contact me if you've got any questions at any time. Join me on LinkedIn if you're so inclined. And if there's any questions, I'm wide open.